Thanks a lot, Dominique and Oliver, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to present this joint work with Nathalie Monet and Lavinia Piemontese from Lausanne and Bocconi University. So basically, I guess, given the audience, and also because everything and a lot has already been said on that question, but I don't have to convince you that conflicts persist and basically shape economies and our societies worldwide. And we are deeply convinced that one of those aspects related to conflict is related on the way we can measure the total cost of violence and the total cost of conflict. One of the reasons is that for policymakers, every potential interventions being or also for prevention policies or recovery are to some extent costly. Okay, so for them, having an idea also about what is the total cost of violence, or better proxy of what is the cost of violence, is something that matters in the trade-off between the benefits and the cost of potential interventions. And related to that, the current approach, and many of you in the room already worked on that aspect, is that a way to approximate the cost of violence is to look at the tangible cost, which is a kind of easy way to measure the cost of violence, especially by infrastructure destructions. And as it was shown just previously by Michele papers, there is also a lot of papers and a quite vibrant literature on the direct consequences. So if, depending on the different actors, but we do have evidence about this direct cost of violence for those actors. But then our approach is also motivated by the fact that there is, since a decade or maybe a bit more, a change in the nature to some extent of the conflict, in the sense that we do observe that more and more conflicts are taking civil war and civil conflict. There is more and more secessionist conflict and regionalism insurrections. And on top of that, many of those violent events or activities are also taking place in more highly complex and also dense production network. And then the aim of this paper is to propose, to some extent, a novel approach and a novel methods in the idea to improve our understanding and our estimate of the total cost of violence. And there we're going to have something that is, I guess, extremely complementary to the previous paper we just seen. We're going to have a focus on films. We're going to be on one specific country, okay? So we'll be in India, and India shared two specific features. I'm going to come back to it also at the time where I'm going to speak a bit more about the context, but two specific features that I guess here are important to take in mind. The first one is that a part of the violence in India, and the one from the Maoist, is really in the eastern part of the country. Okay, so meaning that we do have some district in India, at least on our period of study from 2000 to 2009, where basically some firms are directly affected. So meaning that the production is taking place in some district where there is some Maoist activities, and some other firms are basically in kind of peace district, in the sense they are further away from the conflict. The second point is that this is a kind, while daily, a kind of low intensity violence, meaning that even in districts where there is some Maoist activities, where there is some violent events, we still do observe that there is for firms, some forms of economic activities. So here are the research questions that I'm gonna explain to you also a bit more in few seconds, is how the violence may impact firms' activity when those firms are located in peaceful districts. Okay, so when they are not exposed directly by violence. And then the mechanism that we suggest in that paper and that we try to quantify is basically the production network. And then we consider that the production network is an appropriate mechanism that may explain how this initial shock that suffered by firms could be amplified and could translate and could percolate to firms that are basically operating in some peaceful districts in India. Okay, so now the question is why? Okay, why firms that are in peaceful districts should be affected. Here, there is two first assumptions. The first one is that basically the network of firms, the production network of firms, is given by the firm-specific input bundles that is supplied by other firms. Okay, I'm gonna come back a bit in the theory on that aspect. The second one is that basically firms face a set of potential suppliers for every single inputs they need for the production. Okay, and basically what they're gonna do is to select the most cost-effective supplier that is based basically on productivity, on the quality of the product, and also about trade cost. Okay, so now if there is some conflict in the supplier locations, as we have seen in the previous paper, it changes the behaviors of those firms, and it's gonna affect basically the price of the output of those firms. Okay, now what does it mean for firms that are basically in peaceful areas if they had some supplier in this conflict area? They have basically three main choices. The first one is that what we call the inaction effect, in the sense that they may still keep with the same supplier, okay? So they change nothing. But as I said, and as we know from the literature, they're gonna just bear a new extra cost, okay? Because the price of the outputs, the one that they're gonna use, as an input, could be a bit larger. Okay. Otherwise, there is an alternative option, which is that they're gonna switch to another supplier. Okay, but if they switch to another supplier, maybe in some peaceful areas, it gonna also represent some adjustment cost for the firms. And then the third option is that they're gonna change the inputs. Okay, they're gonna use a different inputs, but of course, if they change the inputs, it may also imply some extra cost for them. So at the end of the day, whatever the choice they're gonna take, those firms that are in a peaceful area, they will support an extra cost because the suppliers are exposed to some violence. And then the aim of the paper is to be able to structurally estimate and quantify the role of this indirect cost that is going through the production network, and in order also to quantify what is the when we miss that part from the production network, to some extent how we under-evaluate the potential total cost of violence for firms. Okay, so here I just give you a bit of a snapshot of what we do in this paper, even if I already say a bit for now, is that both in the theory and the empirics we have two main ingredients. As I guess it was relatively clear. The first one is that we're gonna look at some idiosyncratic distortions that are at the district level. Okay, I'm gonna come back a bit at the time of the data presentations what I mean by that, but that are basically the occurrence or the intensity of conflict from the Maoist group in some districts. The second key ingredients, both in the theory and the empirics, gonna be the production network, okay, that will be defined by the firm's input bundles, and again, I'm gonna come back to that point. In the theoretical framework, just a disclaimer, there is no innovation that side, so meaning that we take a standard model for that literature, which is the seminal paper of Acemoglu and this co-author in 2012, that we just adapt to the context of conflict. What is extremely important in that model is that we are really able to disentangle and to isolate what is the direct effect and the cost of the direct exposure of firms to violence, and to isolate also what is the propagation effect. Okay, so meaning that we're going to have two different costs, the direct one and also the one from the propagation through the production network. In the empirical analysis, so we have many different exercises. We have a reduced form exercise, that for sake of time I won't be able to show you today. We have the structural estimation and the policy simulation, and I hope that I'm going to be able to show you the two. We do have information about Indian manufacturing firm from 2000 to 2009, on which we're going to have detailed information about the inputs that are used by the firms and the outputs of the different firms, and then we're going to be able to explicitly quantify the cost of the conflict and disentangle between the direct exposure and the exposure and the propagation effect. Okay, so in terms of literature and contributions, I guess all of you are more or less on the slide, so I'm sure you are. So let me skip the literature review and just spend a bit more time about the paper of Acemoglu and these co-authors that gives the framework, which I guess is something that is important to also to understand the different mechanism that may explain why the production networks matters if you look at the cost of violence. So it's a relatively standard model in the sense that, you know, the assumptions are relatively easy. The first one is that there is a representative household with a transitional Cobb-Douglas preferences. There is a perfect competition where there is one important point is that the goods that are produced are for consumptions, but also are used as an input by the different firms, which is here a crucial assumptions. And then in terms of technology, it's just very simple Cobb-Douglas with capital, labor, and intermediate goods. And if there is something that is probably the most important here, is that there is a weight here, the omega JA, that just gives the importance for given inputs over the total inputs for given firms, okay? So this is something on which I'm gonna come back, where basically there is some firms, okay, to some extent that are more central to the economy than others, and we're gonna see how it may affect the total cost of violence. Then we have here something that is also standard, which is the profits for a given firm I, where basically you have three different distortions that may come from the activity of the armed groups. You have one first distortion that is related to theft, predation, and also extortion, on which we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence in that context. There is also a second distortion that is given by, you know, some basically capital destructions or the firms that have to pay for security payments, okay, to protect themselves from the Maoist activity. And then there is the last distortions that is related to the access to some inputs, okay? And then we're gonna use those distortions to calibrate to some extent the model, but I'm gonna come back to it. But at the end, at the equilibrium, whatever the distortion, those distortions will increase the firm price of the output of the different firms. Okay. Now, I guess, and this is where really stands the question about how, you know, the shock, this initial shock, may percolate to the whole economy, is really in those slides and the next one. So here, the idea, as I said, is basically the firm's as output can be used by other firms in the economy as an intermediate input. Okay, so here, if a firm high is basically affected, you know, by some violence, it may affect, you know, the production and the profits or the sales of another firm's here, the firm J. Okay, so here, if you look at the total first order effect here, is basically, you know, if for firms, as you have information about the different suppliers, you're able to measure or to quantify and to estimate what could be, you know, the effect on a firm J, while this firm J could be located outside of a conflict zone if one of the suppliers or many of the suppliers are affected by violence. Okay, so we are here able to characterize with these equations, which is the first order effect for a firm J of being, you know, affected through the production network by firms in conflict areas. Then, of course, you know, basically what happens is that firm J, they produce an output. If the output of the firm J is impacted by, you know, the fact that some of the suppliers are affected by violence, the output of firm J will also change, okay? So meaning that firm J output that is used also by other firms as an input will be also affected, okay? So you have a kind of n-order effect that is resumed here in these equations. We just explain how the shock for firm I will be translated to all different firms because of the inputs. And then if you consider all the firms in the economy, you are able to characterize, which is here, you know, the total effect, which helps to derive what we call the influence vector that just give you an information about how could be the magnitude of a shock for given firms, okay? So meaning that if a firm is affected by violence, how it's gonna translate through the whole economy and through all firms, taking into account that every potential output could be used as an input by other firms, okay? So then, if we take, this question about the aggregate output, which is at the end our ultimate questions, we can synthesize everything I'll show you with this very simple way, where basically the aggregate output is given by the model by three main characteristics. The first one, which is the influence vector, which is basically all these production network and production connections of the different firms. It could be also related to the firm level productivity, and more importantly, in our case, by a vector of the conflict affected distortions. Okay, so here, if you look at the percentage change of the output, it just depends on two things. The first thing is about, these firm-specific conflict-induced distortions. Okay, how firms in conflict areas are affected by violence, and then it's gonna depend then about the structure of the network. Okay, and the structure of the network gives also the weight or the importance of each firms in the economy. And the idea here is basically that the cost is going to be larger if firms that are affected by violence are basically firms that are central in the production network. Okay. So now let me give you a bit more one slide for the context, and then I'm going to tell you more about the data and the results. So the maoist insurgency, at least on the period on which we do have the information on firms, from 2000 to 2009, was relatively widespread conflict, relatively long-lasting conflict that has switched toward 2004 to something that is more organized and where we do observe a resurgence of violence. As I told you in the introduction, is basically there is few features of the conflict that for the purpose of the research question is interesting. The first one is that we do have evidence, I'll show you one number later on, that firms' activity, while they are impacted by violence, we still do observe firm activity in places where violence is taking place. There is also a quite large different nature of events, so meaning that there is some events that are related to explosion attacks that may affect a transportation network. There is also some, events related to incidents that may, or fatalities that may affect the local demand, and there is also some events that are related to extortions. Which is interesting also for us, at least in the perspective of the identification, is that from the period on which we do have data on firms from 2000 to 2009, as I told you, there is an increase of violence from 2004. Okay, so there is to some extent some variation over space and over time about the intensity of the violence. And the last point is about the fact that most of the violence, this is what you can see here in the dark blue, are located in the eastern part of the country. Okay, so meaning that over our period, there is some firms, okay, that are going to be affected by Maoist activities, and some firms in the light blue district that were never been affected directly by violence. Okay, and so the idea of the paper is really to quantify the cost of violence for those in dark blue and to see those in the light blue areas, in the peaceful areas, how they are affected through the production network. Okay, so in terms of data, we do have data, a standard one that already been presented many times today from UCDP PRIO, where we have the daily and geolocalized information on those events. Then, more importantly, we have information on the plant data, okay, from 2000 to 2009. We have two key information for them is that we do have the location, so meaning that we do have the districts of those firms, and we do have also information at a quite precise level, at 5-digit level, which represents something like 6K different products, where we do have information for inputs and also for outputs. At the end, we have a bit more than 187K firms over our periods. And interestingly, and this is what I told you, is that there is 18% of firms that are operating in places, in districts where there is some violent events that are taking place. Okay. Now, the crucial aspects, to answer to our research questions is a question about the production network. Unfortunately, if you do want to properly approximate or observe the production network, you need to have some firm-to-firm transactions. Okay, as we do not have these firm-to-firm transactions, we propose a novel strategy that is based on the trade gravity literature, and especially this paper of Bernard and this quarter in 2019, in order to approximate the production network. How do we use that? We do use two different ingredients that are, I guess, relatively standard. The idea is that, for a given buyer, you're going to face different supplier and is more likely to pick up a supplier that is bigger and that is close to him. Okay, so here we use two ingredients. The first one is the distance between every potential supplier and the size of the different suppliers. Okay, as you can see here, I won't click on it, but we do have a lot of different validation strategy and exercise that show that our approximation is something that is coherent, and especially we do have for one single state for West Bengal where we do have firm-to-firm transactions, and we show that there is a strong correlations, and also that our approximation has a power of explanation that is extremely important. So now to quantify, the annual output loss, here I just recall what is our model prediction. So I'm gonna show you the baseline estimate, and then I'll show you some alternative results where we try to go a bit deeper about the different mechanism and to quantify the different mechanism. And then I will speak about, conflict heterogeneity, intensity, and then I will conclude with some policy evaluation. Okay, so here in terms of baseline results, what we do find from the model is that a 1% increase in the conflict-induced distortions is associated with an average annual loss of 0.24% that translate to an average annual GDP loss of 0.035%, which represents something like almost $500 million US. Okay, so here this is really for the baseline estimate. But on top of that, which I think is what a large part of the motivation of that paper, is that over this total cost, how much is coming from the direct exposure and how much is coming from the propagation story. Okay, and what we do find here is that there is 27% of that cost that is coming from the direct exposure of firms in those different districts. Okay, so that means that the remaining 73% are coming from the propagation through the production network. Okay, so here, what does it mean? It means that if we capture the cost of violence by looking only to firms that are located close to violent events, we missed a large part of the total cost of violence for those firms. Okay, so now if you come back to the first point on the quantification, I'll tell you that this is 1 percentage point increase in the distortions. Okay, now what we do is to quantify the distortions. Okay, so the distortions that are facing firms that are in districts where there is some violent event. So here what we do is that we combine, and I can go over it if you want, especially during the coffee, but we combine two different two-step strategies that is corroborated to some extent by the reduced form analysis, an OLS, and then a GMM estimator that helps to identify, the distortions at the state level, state-specific distortions, and also a product-specific distortions. Okay, when we do consider the estimates of those distortions, if we do consider the state-specific distortions, we find that every year it costs 1.2% output loss. Okay, which represents 2.3 billion US dollar. Okay, and if we consider the distortion that is related to the product, we find something that is around 2%. Okay, and we still have for those numbers, the same part that is explained by the direct exposure and the part that is explained through the production network. Now, we do have different scenarios, especially about the different mechanism. Okay, if you do remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I'll tell you that firms may have different choices when the suppliers are affected by violence. It could be the inaction one, the supplier change, or you can change the supplier and change also your input. Okay, so we make use of the richness of our setting to quantify, okay, to change to some extent the influence vector. Okay. The influence vector that is here, okay? We do observe them, we approximate it every year, okay? But then we can, because of the structure of the model, decide that some of the different options are valid or not, okay? So here what we do is that we quantify the inaction effect, Okay, so meaning that we consider that the network that we do observe in the first year is the one that's going to be the same over the years. Okay, and if we do not allow for some reshuffling to some extent of the production network, what we do find is that the annual loss is 11% higher than the baseline. Okay. Now, if we do have a different perspective and different assumptions where we do force to some extent firms to change the supplier if the supplier is affected by violence, we do find that the annual loss is 10% lower. And if we do force firms to change the supplier but also to change the inputs, we do find that the annual loss is 30% lower. Yes? Yes. Now, the point is that, we do have some kind of measure of the complexity of the inputs and how many suppliers you have. So we do have here, I didn't show you, but just for the sake of time, but we can have, some costs to change the supplier, some costs related to the change of the inputs, and then the cost could be related to trade, could be related to the structural aspect of the economy, and then if we play a bit with the cost, we can have some also different effects there. Okay, so we can play with that a bit. Then the second aspect is related to the conflict heterogeneity. So far, what we consider is that for a firm that is in a district that is affected by violence, all the firms in the district is affected in the same way, suffer from the same distortions. Okay, but we do have anecdotal evidence, and I guess it makes sense that the Maoist activity does not affect firms, all the firms, in the same way. Okay, and especially because there is a large part of the Maoist activity that is related to extortions, and basically what they target is mainly the biggest firms. Okay, so here what we do is that if we keep constant the effort of the Maoist insurgency, what we look at is they concentrate all the effort to only the 10% largest firms. Okay, we do find that the annual loss is more than doubled in comparison to the baseline estimates. Okay, so here, based on the heterogeneity or the effort of the Maoists, we're gonna find some effect that is much larger than the baseline. And now, just to conclude and to finish, we do have some exercise in terms of policy experiments. The first one is related to what's going to be the cost. Okay, if the conflicts basically spread to neighboring districts, and what we do find is that for a year, if there is a spread of the Maoist activity to neighboring districts, it's gonna increase by 55% the total cost for a year of the Maoist insurgency. Now, if you take the side of the policymakers and you say, okay, look, what we know is that basically some firms are maybe more central in the network than others. Okay, so now the question is how much you can reduce the cost of the conflict by protecting the most important firms in the network. Okay, and here what we just try to quantify is that if the aim of the policymaker is to halve the cost of the conflict, how many firms you have to protect. And here we just have the ranking about how important they are in the production network, and we're able to show that if you protect 4% of the top firms, the most important firms in the network, you are able to halve 50% of the total cost of violence. Okay, and then the last one is that a large part of our story is how easy it is for a buyer to change a supplier. Okay, so here we do have some exercise where we to some extent we facilitate or we reduce the trade frictions. Okay, that makes that changing the supplier is something that become less costly. So we do compute some cost vector that is related, Paul, to your questions, and especially taking into account the paper of Boehm and Oberfeld in 2020, where they show that there is some very important trade frictions across state in India because of some legal and institutional differences across the states. And what we do show is that if you do reduce drastically the trade frictions, you may also reduce by 40% the annual loss in comparison to the baseline. Okay, so here just an illustration about how useful are also those models to quantify which kind of policy should be, the less costly and gonna be have a potential benefit that is important. Okay, so let me just conclude to quote Dominique in one of these paper with Matthias on the idea that we really need to improve our understanding to some extent about these consequences of violence, and especially going through this question about the cost of violence that may also something important for regions, places, or actors that are outside of those regions. Thanks a lot for your attention. No, we don't. Could you repeat the question? Or just why they're not considering the Hindu-Muslim conflict? I think so. Many reasons for that. The first one, I guess, it's a question about the data. If I do remember well, at the time we looked at that, we didn't find good data or precise data for our time period. The second one is, related to what I said previously. The nature of the events from the Maoists, they were really targeting. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence that they really target a lot firms. How this is, it's a extreme left, group. They were really looking at the more intensive and capital-intensive firms, and they were really trying to extort a part of the money, which is, for us, from the theoretical perspective, something that is important, because if you do remember in our profit functions, you have different way, to have some extortions and to have some cost for the firms. So it was also motivated by that aspect. Okay. Wouldn't it be government-owned firms? I mean, it's against the government, right? Sorry, what do you mean? Sorry. The movement's against the government, so wouldn't it be government-owned firms? Here we do not observe exactly which firms are targeted. Okay, so we do control for the fact that some firms are owned by the government, some others are not, and there is some switch also on the ownership. But we don't use that dimension to analyze the cost of the conflict, especially because I guess we don't have very clear idea from the theory what we should expect if it's owned by the government or if it's owned by private entrepreneurs.
Government guys, you had to bribe like multiple people, and so I guess it kind of relates to this kind of question of the counterfactual. So if you're going to get extorted, is there an inclusion of the fact that the government also has these guys who are holding up for them and so forth in that sense?
That's a very good point. So I can't say much about it. Maybe two answers is that we do have a part further away in the paper where we look at the data from the World Bank, the one that were presented before by Michele, about the constraints. Okay, and what we do find is that firms that are located in districts with Maoist activities, they report having more constraints. Okay, so maybe it's a part of the reply that maybe in two cases you have constraints. Okay, it could be the government if you don't have Maoist activities, but it seems that at least when there is some Maoist activities, you still have a bit more of constraints. Okay, so maybe this is a part of the story, and something that corroborates to some extent your question in the paper of Boehm in 2020, where basically they really show that everything that's related to the quality of the institutions that takes into account to some extent what you said about the corruption and the bribing. Really is something that reduced trade across states. So I guess, maybe this is, but unfortunately we cannot, but it is a good point that maybe we have to think about it about the counterfactual. That's a good point. Thank you. Yes.
So you were highlighting a channel that really deteriorates what's happening in peaceful areas, but the net effect is unclear. No? So for instance, when the independentist movement in Catalonia was very high, and it was very uncertain moment, a lot of firms just moved to Madrid. So I think the net effect for Madrid was actually quite positive, even though there was a lot of disruption.
Yeah.
In the
It's a very good point. So here, two potential replies. The first one is that we look in the reduced form analysis about winners and losers, and it corroborates what you said. So definitively there is winners, and so firms that are outside of the conflict zone, they take advantage of the violence. So if you look at the market share, if you look at profit, that increase for them. Okay, this is I guess a first part of the reply. Now, how it may affect our estimates is that basically as we do estimate, every year the production network, it's to some extent net to potential entry or exit of firms into peaceful districts or conflict districts. Okay, so to some extent our production network is net of that effect. Okay, thank you.